For my inaugural episode, I sat down with life coach Dave Moss. Dave was one of the first people I reached out to when I started to seek a change in my life, so it only made sense to have him on as my first guest. Dave and I talk about his transition from wedding photographer to life coach and how he approaches this important work with clients. We also share how our recent moves closer to nature are having an impact on our lives, and we exchange anecdotes on microdosing psilocybin, a tool that is really gaining momentum in the Western world. As I listen back on this first episode, I feel that I could have opened up more with stories of my own and not stuck so much to the role of interviewer. I'm grateful that this made it into my awareness so that I can adjust it for future interviews. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dave Moss. Dave
Hey
Moss.
there.
How you doing?
Good, you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, are you kidding me? As soon as you reached out, I was like, yes, absolutely.
Like I told you by email, you were like for the longest time the first person I was going to reach out to for this podcast. It was such an ode to, the journey that I've been on, and knowing that you were such an integral part of the first step. So it felt like, bring you on as the first guest for the podcast. Made a lot
I
of
love
sense.
it. I mean, you and Davina have been on a hell of a journey over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it has been.
How's it feel to be in Costa Rica?
It feels great. We're settling in so nicely, and the pace of life, we're just like in awe of it every single day. I think we went to yoga this morning, and I realized that we're having like the perfect day that you made us envision,
Yeah.
during our exercises as you were life coaching us. And I was just like, whoa, we are doing these perfect days, that we thought we could only dream of months ago. Now they're actually reality here. So it's been really special. We're super happy, and the kids are happy, and we're settling in nicely.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Abby and I have been living vicariously through all of your stories.
Thanks. How are you settling into your new place, new life?
Good. It's not the full shift that we originally aimed for, because we were going to move out to the West Coast. And then Abby went out for a week and went looking at houses and things, and just realized that for what we want in our life right now and the cost of living on the island, it just wasn't aligning. But we knew we wanted to have access to nature and everything else. And I just, like, offhandedly, while she was out there frustrated looking at house after house, just said, what about South Calgary? Like, if we can get a house that's right across the street from Fish Creek Park, which is this like 18,000 plus acre natural area in the city. She's like, I don't know, maybe. And so she came home, we started looking at houses, and I think we looked at like 20 different houses. And then this one was one of the first ones that she had seen on the real estate listings and fell in love with it. And I was like, I don't know, it's top of our budget. Like, if it gets into a bidding war, like everything was at that point in time, like we're not going to have a lot of wiggle room. And so we just forgot about it. And then 6 weeks later, they had reduced the price. It was still on the market. They forgot to check off that it had an attached garage and an ensuite. So obviously it wasn't showing up on anybody else's search listing. And so we just came and looked at it. It's right across the street from the park, checked all the boxes. And so Abby's just like, I think that house was waiting for us. Like, everything aligned. They had no offers on it, nothing like that. And it was the perfect house. So it's been lovely. Being able to take the dogs out into the woods 2 or 3 times a day has been good for everybody. And so, it's been awesome.
Good. I'm glad you guys chose to be closer to nature. It's such an important part, for humans to just feel closer to nature. So
it was number one on both of our lists, whether we ended up on Vancouver Island or stayed somewhere in Alberta. Number one we had to be close to nature. And it all came from, like, we walked our dogs in the woods as long as we've had them, but we used to have to drive for it. And then we were house sitting Lenny and Erica Mann's house for a couple of weeks, and we could just walk to the end of their road and be in the woods because they live in the mountains. And we're just like, okay, no, this is what we need for for our happiness and for the dog's happiness. Like for Juniper, our second dog, she was feral when we rescued her. She was an Arizona street dog, and she was terrified of people, terrified of us, terrified of everything. But every time we took her out in nature, she got a little bit better.
That's
And
interesting.
So,
even
yeah.
with dogs, you know.
Yeah, even with her. And so now that we're here and she gets to do this every day, she's like, we had my nieces over for Thanksgiving yesterday, and it was the first time that they got to see her wagging her tail and like walking around the house, because it used to be anytime anybody came to the house, she would just curl up in like the tightest little ball on her dog bed in the corner of the room and wouldn't move as long as people were here. And now she's coming out of her shell, and we attribute it entirely to her being able to walk in the woods every day.
Yeah, pretty amazing what nature has of effect, you know, on our nervous system. It really, you know, calms you down and brings you to a place of peace. And it's pretty interesting to hear that with dogs as well. Obviously it makes total sense, but
yeah, makes total sense. And like at our old house, we had a fairly large backyard, and that was the only place that she would bond with Abby before. And so we're like, we knew that was something that she wanted, but we just couldn't provide it at the time to the level that she wanted.
mm-hmm.
How's it been for you guys and the kids, like having the beat? Because I mean, you were already kind of attached to nature in your house in Quebec, but is it different down there?
We were, but for some reason, I think at the other house, you know, as much as we were on the lakefront and we were in the woods, we still spent a lot of time indoors. And you know, with the comfort of being inside and like cuddled up and trying to avoid the mosquitoes and avoid the weather. And whereas here, I don't know, just so much more of life happens outdoors, and you're just kind of like pushed outside. As you can try and resist it and stay inside, but it doesn't feel good the same way that it did back home.
Yeah.
I still say back home, but I realize home is here now. Yeah, so we're so much closer, you know, with nature. And what's beautiful here too, like very simple, but like the sun sets at the exact same time year round. There's no, you know, 4 p.m. sunset versus 9 p.m. sunset during the summer. So you kind of, the days are similar in a way, but not in a way that's kind of depressing, in a way that it takes away any kind of pressure with needing to be outside. So even if you end up spending, you know, a little less time outside today, you know that you don't have to worry about a snowstorm coming in the next day, or that the sun is going to start setting at 4 p.m. in the next few weeks. You know, you don't have those elements to deal with. Mm-hmm. So there's no pressure on the outside to actually be outside, which then makes it easier to be outside, oddly enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because like we were a little worried when we first moved here, tail end of autumn. That's like, oh, is it going to be different when it's winter? But you know, this morning it was -6, and Abby was like, oh, I don't know if I want to go for a walk. It's cold. I'm kind of tired. I got a call soon. And I'm like, just come anyways. You'll feel better. And as soon as we both got outside, like sun is shining, the air is crisp. And we're just like, okay, yeah, we're going to do this all winter, I think, as long as the dogs are up for it. Because basically anything below -10 and our oldest dog is just like, no, I'm staying in.
One of my other favorite things about moving in general has been the ability to kind of reset our habits. And, you know, it provides you with like this golden opportunity to really form new habits and shed some of the old. Have you felt a bit of a change in your routine? And
absolutely. Yeah. Like I'm not a morning person in general, but here we have our master bedroom upstairs looks out onto, we have like vaulted ceilings in the front of our house, and it's like 2-story windows. And so the sunrise comes in through those every morning. And so we just leave the double doors into the bedroom open. And every time the sun hits our room, the dogs wake up, we wake up, and I'm like, I'm not really fighting it anymore. And in our past house, we had blackout curtains and everything. So when morning came, it's just like, I still just wanted to stay in bed. And so that's been really nice. And then just eating healthier, the fact that we don't have to drive to take the dogs means our day flows a lot better. And I loved our old house, but there were always things as you walked around it where you're like, oh, I should get to that someday, and I should do that someday. And that ever-present guilt of wanting to improve and wanting to do those things. And then it looks internally as well. And you just never really truly escape them. I can never remember if it was blue zones of happiness or happiness hypothesis, but Erica Mann and I always recommend books to one another. And we were both reading those simultaneously a couple of years ago. And it was in there that the quickest way to increase the happiness in your life is to change your environment. And this is the first time that I've really felt that. Like, we've moved a couple of times before, but it was never for the right reasons. But this time, like, moving for the access to nature, moving to increase our ability to socialize because we have a built-in community here in South Calgary and things. It's really felt like, oh yeah, I already feel internal and external happiness are sort of like reaching this stasis, and it's really nice.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's definitely been what we've experienced as well, and we went from like selling and our house and packing up everything and storing it and returning our car the day that we were flying here. So it was, like the full experience of what it is to leave and move. But the moment we got here, we had no house to worry about, and just the few suitcases that we flew in with. So we got so much brain space and so much of our time given back to us. And we just kind of jumped right into going to yoga every day, going to gym, eating healthier, spending time on the beach. And, we started creating those new habits really rapidly, and they're still holding, that's been 3, almost 4 weeks. So yeah. The move is definitely what enabled us to do this.
Do you find having fewer things makes it easier?
It does. Not so much the things, but also not having a house to worry about. We're building here, so eventually we will have a house to manage. But for now, we're just renting on Airbnb. And so we arrive at a house, has everything that we need. So, we don't need to worry about any of those things, and there's no maintenance to worry about. So that definitely helps. But for sure, having less stuff with us is a gift. And for the kids too, like, they brought so few toys with them, and their toys are now the rocks and sticks and the waves on the beach. And we don't hear them complain that they're missing anything from back home.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I fell down the rabbit hole of TikTok recently, and there's parenting advice from Jack Black, and he had said, never try to make a happy kid happier. If your kid is sitting in the mud playing with sticks and rocks, like, don't feel like you need to go buy them plastic toys because they're already happier. And it's like that simplicity, I think, carries on to us as adults. It's like, if you're already happy, don't feel like you need to push it to a next level, keep up with the Joneses or whatever. And I was just like, oh yeah, that's a good lesson.
Very much, very good lesson. Also, don't interfere if they're playing, whatever it is that they're doing. If they're like in a flow state and they're playing, now's the time to sit back and just kind of let them do their thing. That's one thing that I've learned over the years.
Yeah,
and you go in and you interrupt the playtime, it just never ends well.
Can you join the playtime, or does joining interrupt it?
No, that's generally well received, I think. Something that I still struggle with, some play is easier, like going to jump in the waves with the kids. Obviously, I enjoy it just as much as they do. But some other, games that they make up and that they want us to play with, I think it's a struggle for a lot of parents, to just go into like that inner child and use our imagination and creativity and try to play with our kids. And I know it's important, and I know that it gives them the model that they can stay kids, even as adults. But I struggle with that, and I actively try to work on it, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I think you and I may have talked about that a while ago, and I've been watching my niece. She's 11 now. I've been watching her grow up because I'm curious if it's an age-based thing when we lose that ability to play imagination games so much, or if it is like a societal cultural thing where we lose that. Because for me, one of the biggest things that I do every week is I play make believe with my friends in Dungeons and Dragons, but like, I think it requires that like set and setting and kind of a rigid structure around it for us to all come together and do that collaborative storytelling. But when my 5-year-old niece is like, hey, let's go play doctor, I struggle with it as well, even though I do it as a hobby. It's such an interesting thing. Like, I don't know when or how we lose. I'm sure some very smart person out there has done the research and knows exactly, but
Yeah, for sure. I don't have the scientific answer.
yeah.
But I relate to the struggle.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of the, living in nature is definitely something I wanted to talk about. So it's interesting to hear how it has affected you. I want to hear more about, how you switched from being a photographer and into life coaching. What do you feel was the call for you, and how did you make that transition?
I still don't really know when it exactly happened. I mean, throughout my whole life, having really interesting conversations with people had always been something that I enjoyed. I suck at small talk. I'm kind of a chronic oversharer, and I expect that of other people. So even in high school, like, I would meet somebody new and we would go for a cup of coffee or something, and it would just I'm like, let's just dive right in. I have no interest in knowing the little things. That'll come with time. Instead, I want to learn the big things, because then I can understand you. And with that, I think as I was younger came a little bit of maybe arrogance. I've always was a problem solver, and so I always wanted to solve other people's problems. As I got older, I realized that everybody already has the answers to their problems, but I need to figure out how to help them get there. And so that came in the form of, for a while, technical knowledge, teaching photographers how to figure things out on their own, teaching them how to use flash or find a moment or do things like that. And then eventually Abby actually was starting to burn out on photography and was saying, she knows I work well under pressure with a deadline. And so she said, 2020 is going to be our last year shooting weddings. Not knowing that there was a global pandemic coming and pushing that off a little bit. But I'm like, okay, this is great. Like, I need to have something new by then. I knew I didn't want to go back to my day job of engineering. I had enjoyed the entrepreneurial life, having time control and things like that. And so I just started looking for other things. Maybe I'll be a speaker, maybe I'll do this. And we had gone for a dinner with two friends of ours, and Catherine was a life coach. I was like, what? I keep hearing this term. I'm not really on Instagram. I don't know what that means. Tell me more about it. And so she talked to me. She specifically life coaches women executives. That's her niche. And she told me about this Martha Beck program that she had taken. And I'm like, oh, this is super, super fascinating. And then it just fell out of my brain as we went on, and it was in the middle of wedding season. So we got busy and we did other things. And then we had gone to do an engagement session for this couple who they were getting married in Italy, but they were moving there for a year. And we're like, wow, how are you doing this? And they're like, oh, we're both life coaches, so we can work online. And I'm like, okay, this is twice in a couple of weeks that this life coach thing has come up. And so I started doing some research into it. I thought maybe this might be something that would work for me. And then I looked at that Martha Beck training program, and enrollment closed within 2 weeks, and the next thing was starting, and she only does it every 9 months. And Abby was like, you keep talking about this thing, just take the course. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but just take the course. And so I enrolled. And part of the enrollment program is you have to start reading her books. She has many books, I think 9 or 10 now. So I just started reading them. And as she was talking about what life coaching was and the way that she helps people, and I'm like, yeah, like every molecule in my body lit up. I'm like, this is what I'm meant to do. And so I just dove in head first. And then at the end of the course, in order to get certified, you have to have like 75 hours of coaching. So I just put a thing up on Facebook, and 48 people said, yep, I could use some help. And then once I started, then I was just hooked, and it just slowly took over. And I focused mostly on business originally, because I had hired my own business coach, because I'm like, how do I start a coaching business? How does one market this? Because that was one aspect that was missing from the coaching program that I took. And she said, well, you have at that point in time 10 years of experience in the photography business. You and Abby have been very successful financially and photographically. So why don't you call yourself a business coach and then trick people into life coaching? Because that's really going to be your secret sauce. That's because I had very quickly realized doing workshops over the years that the things that hold photographers back are almost always internal. They don't value themselves, or they have a lack of confidence. And so it's not, their business isn't a business problem most of the time, not all the time. It's a personal problem. And so that became my process. And then it just slowly moved into life coaching. Like my new website comes out soon, and it's just focused on life coaching, not business coaching anymore, because I think I had to gain the confidence as a coach to just say that this is actually what I want to do. I don't need to backdoor the good stuff anymore. So
right. Beautiful. Yeah. For those who are a little less familiar with life coaching, or have only, heard the terms, but not quite sure what it is, how would you describe it? And more importantly, how does it differ from, more traditional therapy?
Yeah. I mean, the way that I describe it, I don't think that there are any hard and fast rules when it comes to life coaching, because it is such a broad thing. It is a non-regulated industry, so you don't have to get certified. There's no, board or anything else like that. So everybody looks at it a little bit differently. From my perspective, life coaching is for somebody who is looking for a change or has a goal in mind, but is struggling to achieve that and doesn't know how to get there. So I equated a lot, even though I'm not a sports person, I equated a lot to sports coaching, because, a really good basketball coach or hockey coach or something like that, their job isn't to teach the player how to play the game. The player already knows how to play the game. They grew up playing it. They've learned the rules over time. What that coach is there to do is help that player, or all of the players, be the best versions of themselves, on and off the court. And that's the way that I look at life coaching. Is someone's going to come to me usually with a specific problem in mind, where I'm working too much, or I feel aimless, or any other number of things. And once we start working together, you peel back the layers of the onion, and then I help them figure out how to be I help them find that person inside themselves that they already know is there, so that they can move on to the next phase of their life. And how that differs from therapy, in my mind, is that therapy is often not always, but often a response to some kind of trauma. You are working through some sort of struggle. The trauma could be a mental health issue, which could be genetic or environmental. It could be from some past thing, something that happened in a childhood or a previous relationship. And often it's a longer journey. You are unpacking, and the therapist is just there to poke and prod in the right way. Whereas I find coaching is a shorter period of time. It's goal focused, and I can be a little harsher to a coaching client than maybe I would a therapy client, where because it's not a trauma response thing. We may uncover some trauma in there, but generally speaking, it's because it's goal focused. I can push a little harder and say, I think you should go for this sort of thing, as opposed to, I think with therapy, you need to be a little bit more gentle as somebody is unburdening themselves of this past. Does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense. When we worked together for a year, it was very intertwined with my spiritual journey as well. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's common, or not so much, and people generally stay focused on, the goals that they're trying to achieve?
I think because of who I am and the path that I walk, the people who are attracted to me as a coach generally have spiritual curiosity. Not everybody is ready to go down that path, but they often have a lot of questions about it. And over time, I find a lot of people will tend to lean in that direction. When I was in my coaching program, one of the teachers, Michael Trotta, talked about this as original medicine, where every healer or coach or person who helps other people in their life will usually have gone through some struggle. And that struggle will often end up being a cornerstone in their practice. And that spiritual struggle was a big thing for me in my marriage with my wife, because she's a very spiritual person, and I had some pretty deep spiritual wounding from organized religion as a child. And so I think unconsciously it became part of my practice, just because people tend to like attracts like. And so I think in a lot of that ways, people will find me not necessarily because they're looking for spiritual openness, but because it's something that is curious, or maybe a bit of a wound in them, and it just comes out during our conversation.
And I feel like now as a society, I think everybody's discovering their spiritual side more and more. I think it makes sense that it would be more and more intertwined with, wanting a change in our life.
Yeah.
They just go so hand in hand, and I'm glad that you're able to merge the two. And for me, it was extremely helpful as we work together.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. And I think the more that spirituality becomes untied from religion, I think you're right. A lot of people are looking for that to be a part of their life, because it can be whatever it needs to be. It no longer is defined by, you have to go to a building every, Sunday, or follow these specific rules. Spirituality is now more of a personal journey than anything else like that. And I think it's great that it's becoming more acceptable for people to go on a spiritual journey, and it not be like eye rolly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What are some of the exercises that someone would experience while life coaching with you?
So a lot of my life coaching exercises come from my training with Martha Beck. And when I was looking for a program, and how I ended up there, was a lot of life coaching programs that I saw outside of hers were very left brain, very spreadsheety, very like pros and cons list kind of things. And that was not, like, I was an engineer in my previous life. It was not at all how I wanted a coaching program to go. So I was very attracted to this very middle ground woo, emotionally driven, but with a psychology background. Like a lot of it is based on cognitive behavioral therapy and sociology and psychology. And so I was like, okay, there's some grounding in science, but it was more feeling than thinking. And so a lot of my tools that I use in my work is more feeling than thinking. I get people to tie back into their physical bodies for decision-making process and body compass, especially because most of my clients are North American, and a lot of us are either in our heads overthinking everything, or we're completely disconnected from our bodies entirely, and we no longer have any tie to that. And so that affects the way we sleep, the way that we exercise, the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we react. So that's a big part of it. And then it's just a lot of thought exercise, a lot of vision casting. You're talking about ideal day. I'm not like a where do you see yourself in 5 years kind of person. Instead, I'm just like, dream as big as you possibly can, because if nothing else, then you have a direction to aim your life. If that is the ultimate goal, then you can just slowly pick things up along the way. For us, the ideal day that I had done when I originally did my coaching program, we were living on the West Coast in a forest. So I knew nature had to be a part of wherever I ended up. We haven't yet ended up on the West Coast, but we still have our forest. And so it's like that sort of thing of dreaming the best picture and then moving in that direction. And that particularly came to me because I was an aimless person for a lot of my life. I was the kid who grew up, I tried 7 different sports. I tried 11 different musical instruments. I was in every hobby and club because I was always looking for that one thing that I would be really, really good at, thinking that's what people go through in life. You find that one thing you're good at, and then you're great. You're set for the rest of your life, not knowing at the time that not everybody goes that way. And so my tools, I think, are around people. I use a lot of hiking terminology in my coaching practice, and I just see myself as a guide. And so a lot of the tools are just guiding people in whatever direction they need to go. I don't have the answers, you have the answers, but you may not know what that answer is or even how to get there. So I help you find the path.
Yeah, I think the goal setting is such an underrated tool. And in my personal life, it's something that I've used unconsciously. When Davina and I wanted to become destination wedding photographers, we literally gave ourselves that goal without defining it as a goal and visualizing what that career could look like. But I think we were doing that on our own. And then, every opportunity that came our way that was in line with that goal, we jumped on it, and eventually we realized that goal. And then when time was, it was time to move on from that career, then, we managed to end it. And then we started setting our sights on having a simpler life, being closer to nature, taking care of ourselves, being really close to our kids, being there for them. And that's kind of what we've been leading up to for the last 2 years, I think.
Do you guys find that you have sort of broader goals initially and then you narrow the focus over time as you figure it out? Or is it a very specific end point that is in mind?
Good question. I think it also goes more with like what it feels like and how do we want to feel by achieving this goal. We ended up here in Costa Rica, but it easily could have been, so many other places as well. So it wasn't super specific. But as much as we were achieving that goal right now, we still don't fully know what we want to do with our life next. My big thing right now is to try to just surrender to life and really let things flow and not go chasing after anything. And so whatever opportunity comes my way, then I will explore that. But I just know that I want to work more closely with people. Photography was a good medium, but it was always sort of like this tool between myself and the subject. Yeah. And as much as I appreciate it, I felt this sort of like limitation. It made me very quiet and focused. And those are things that I want to break free from a little bit more. I want to be more in conversation with people and help them in a more direct way. But I have yet to find out exactly what that looks like or what I'll do with it. I feel like I've been in like the spiritual cocoon for the last like almost a year now. And now I've touched my bottom and I'm ready to kind of come out of it, but I'm slowly making my way out. And this podcast is a good example of that. I've wanted to do it for a long time, but a year ago, there's no way that I would have sat down and done it. It required us coming here and quieting the external in order for me to be able to do this. And one of the other things that I wanted to do, I've been talking about it to myself for the last couple months, is to do a men's circle. Where, and you were talking about this too, like the superficial conversation, like I too, like I can only handle it, for a few minutes, but I also want to go deep and be vulnerable and talk about real things with other people. And in my experience, men's circles are a great way to do this, because the moment you step into the circle, be it physical or online, you're agreeing to be in a place of truth and vulnerability and have an open heart, for yourself and for everyone else in the circle. And so I wanted to bring that to my circle of friends. And literally the week that we landed here in Costa Rica and our schedule opened up, I knew I had no more excuses. So I sat down and wrote out the email and sent it to, the 12 guys that I wanted to be part of this. And we're slowly scheduling our first circle to take place in the coming weeks. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I find having groups of men like that is very, very fascinating. I used to, years ago, I would always roll my eyes when there was, women's circles or things like that. Cause I'm like, oh, why does it have to be one gender? Why does it have to be this? And now I kind of see the beauty in that. Not that it has to be one way or the other way, but I've unconsciously collected men around me who I know would be comfortable with that sort of thing. Like all of my male friends will say I love you, and they will always be confident and fine with that, and share in that way. And it's a different thing when it comes from a guy than when it comes, it's kind of expected that women are going to be softer and they're going to be more emotional. so when you have a group of men who can share like that, I think there's something beautiful for it. And vice versa with women. Like Abby has women's circles, and she's got these mentorship that's like classes that she teaches with just women, and she's like, oh, it's so powerful. And I would ask, I'm like, would you have a guy in that class? She's like, yeah, but I think it would change the dynamic. And I think for better or for worse, as a species that has two biological sexes, there's a shared experience. And even with people who are transgender, I have my friend Nick, and since he's transitioned, he's like, oh, I get guys so much more now. Like there's things that I just sort of took for granted or thought that were silly until I took on this gender role. And now I understand why men are, maybe a little bit more closed off or feel that they need to just be providers and be quiet and not accept things on their own and things, because that's the way that society has programmed that gender role. It's just, yeah. So I think that's great. I think a men's circle is going to be a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I think there's definitely containers that are good for sort of co-ed, but it's nice to have these sacred containers for just for women and just for men as well.
So I'm curious, you used a word there that just triggered something. You went through that training. I don't know if you've completed it yet, but wasn't one focused on sacred masculine, one on feminine? And then I don't remember what the
That's
third
correct.
one was.
So yeah, the Fit for Service with Aubrey Marcus. We're in our last trimester now, and which is Sacred Union. And at the beginning of the year, I actually wasn't aware of masculine and feminine energies and what they meant. I would hear those words and I would assume that it was linked to the sex. So it's been interesting for me to learn, how that applies to both men and women.
How does it apply to you in your life? Do you view masculine and feminine differently in yourself and in your children and in your life now?
Yeah, definitely. I think where I see it most recently, especially, is just how it plays into my mood. I used to think that I was in a bad mood. I'm just having a bad day. But now I realize that I'm just maybe a little bit more in my feminine, and I need to take a step back from doing, which is a very masculine energy, and be a little bit more internal and rest a little bit more and do the things that are more intuitive and, restore my things that are on the inside for me before then bringing that into creation on the outside, which is the masculine energy. And it's something that I'm still learning to apply on a daily basis. But just recognizing those concepts has for sure changed the way that I show up in the world every day.
Yeah, it's really once you start to wrap your head around it in a different way, I think it's very, very helpful that it's not just a gender thing. It is like we all have masculine and feminine energy in us, and some of us are really balanced and some of us tend to lean one way or the other way. It wasn't until I started learning this through my coaching program and through my wife and her journey into spirituality that I realized that I tend to lean more feminine. It's like my biological sex is male, but my energy, I think, is more feminine than it is masculine. And it, like, as soon as I started to wrap my head around that, I'm like, oh, so many things make so much more sense now.
And for those listening, I think it's important to remember also there's a shadow side, to each of those energies. And it can become, there are toxic aspects as well to just be aware of. Like with the feminine, yes, it's about listening and having intuition and inner creativity, but if we retract too far and become lazy, then we're kind of stepping into a bit of the shadow side.
You used a word when I interviewed you for our Businesses and Venture podcast years ago or a year ago that has stuck in my brain ever since. And I use it now. Instead of using the word balance, I use the word harmony.
Yeah, that was passed on to me from Sarah Monica, who might end up listening to this episode as well.
Yeah.
But I think she got that from someone as well. But I'm glad it's making the rounds.
Oh, totally. It just makes so much more. It's just like it's a clearer and yet softer term for so many things. Because when we think balance, we think equal, but harmony it's just like everything just works together in whichever configuration that it's in.
Yeah, so it's not a 50-50 thing. There's actually
Yeah.
no percentage in harmony. It just needs to work together, however that looks.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
is.
Thanks for
Yeah.
reminding me of that.
Yeah, anytime. I tell everybody about that.
Are you still big with mushrooms? And I'll preface that with the fact that I've been microdosing for the last, let's say, 6 to 8 months, and it's been really a life changer for me. And when you microdose, like, you don't get high off anything, and you barely notice it in your body or in your habits. But I heard someone else say that it's kind of like a little 1% change every single day. And then once you look back on it at the end of the year or after a few months, you're like, whoa, a lot of things have changed, or my perception and the way that I interact with life around me has changed quite a bit. Are mushrooms still a part of your life as well?
Yes, very much. Macrodosing, not as much, but that mostly just had to do with I had a very busy life for the last sort of 18 months. And so I find when I macrodose, it's like turning the computer off and turning it back on again. It resets everything. And when I'm in a very doing mode, I find that a struggle, because often it leads to large shifts in my life. And so if I'm doing and then all of a sudden I want to have a large shift, I'm like, I can't handle this right now. But microdosing, yes, absolutely. It used to be.
Sorry, for those who don't know,
Yeah.
what's the difference between macrodosing and microdosing?
So it's microdosing is usually, milligrams. Like my microdose milligram, I usually take 200 milligrams a day, and it's a non-hallucinogenic. It is generally just like, I always just say, it just kind of makes the world, it bumps the saturation up a little bit. It makes everything a little bit brighter, a little bit clearer, a little bit more creative. It lightens heaviness. Like a lot of my anxiety goes away when I microdose. Whereas a macrodose, it's a gram plus normally. For a lot of people, you could even do what's called a heroic dose, which is traditionally 5 grams or more. And those are usually large resets. Usually when people talking about mushrooms, they talk about microdosing. They talk about a large dose. It's where people joke that they see dragons and they do things like that. Hasn't been my experience with mushrooms, but that's how I started, was with large doses, usually with groups of friends, but in very calm sets and settings. It wasn't parties. It was, we would all take some, we would hang out and talk for a little bit. People would go off and do their own things. And then we would all talk the next day about how it went and how do you feel. One of the first times that Abby and I ever talked all night was because of a macro dose of mushrooms. And they were great. It was often a full nervous system reset, and helped me discover new things about myself, because it led to deep introspection. And then that transitioned into microdosing, which was just trying to find a way to capture some of the introspection, creativity, and brightness of a larger dose, but still being functional. And I had read about, microdosing LSD, microdosing psilocybin, other things like that. And so I decided to try it out. And for the first little while, it did nothing, like you said, you don't even notice it. But I use a mood tracker, and over time there was definite I had more project ideas. I was more focused. I had fewer bad days, so on and so forth. So yeah.
I did the mood tracker as well while we were still, coaching together for a few months. What I realized after a while is it was creating this invisible pressure for me to have a good day. It's, response-based, feedback. And so I had to stop it, because I didn't want to wake up every day with the expectation, today I must put in a green smiley face at the end of the day.
I definitely, it's like an even 50-50 split of people who feel that pressure and then people who don't. And so if there's no shame in that. If it didn't work for you, there's a million tools in the tool bag.
It was great though while I used it, and it did, it actually pushed me into journaling as well, which has become a
Mhm.
big part of my practice. Like I write almost every day, and if I don't, then I definitely feel it in my body that, you know, I have things that need to come out and be written about.
Yeah.
But yeah, just having that app with put in the mood, and then you had a little box for notes. And at first it was just point form, you know, what I did that day. And then that transitioned into a few thoughts and then a few feelings, and then it turned into like full on journaling. And then I did a journaling class with Eric Godzi, who's one of the
Mhm.
coaches on Fit for Service. And that was just, you know, going deep into personal trauma and you know, envisioning what life could be like. So that was like a more intense class, but I love journaling. I also think it's one of the very underrated tools out there that can
Yes.
just help us process a lot of things.
Yeah. Tying the two together, microdosing is what finally allowed me to properly stream of consciousness journal.
Mm.
I always, I struggled with structure, and like I felt like I was, for you feeling that pressure to have a green smiley face from the app, I felt the pressure that my journaling had to have an outcome. And it wasn't until I started microdosing consistently that I would get up in the morning and just brain dump into a journal, and then it would just release that part of myself, and then I could go on about the day. Because if I had put it down on paper, it is no longer swirling around in my mind. But it took the microdose to get me to a point where I'm like, oh, I can just put this down and I don't have to feel anything about it. Like, it's done, I can move on. It doesn't necessarily, it has a purpose, but it doesn't have to be like a structured purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Uh, how often do you microdose? On my end, what I do is I do mushroom microdose day one, skip, mushroom, skip, and then LSD microdose as well, which I started more recently, and then skip again. Do you follow like a similar pattern, or?
I usually, I mean, it's varied over the time. It used to be, I used to do 2 on, 2 off. Now I do 4 on, 3 off. And I find that fourth day, I always, that's like my most effective day. But if I go 5, if I try to push it one further, no effect. So yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how much of that is mental and how much of that is the plant, but that just seems to be the rhythm that's working for me
Nice.
now.
Have you
Yeah.
tried the LSD microdose as well? And have you seen
I have not. No, it's been something that I've been wanting to try, but just haven't got around to it yet.
Yeah, like it's, I feel like it's a different effect. It's like instead of bumping up saturation, you're bumping up vibrance and clarity. It's like
Mm.
very similar, but kind of, you know, off to the left a little bit.
Makes sense. I know a lot of programmers who microdose LSD and find it helps them with their coding, with that
Mhm.
clarity aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
While we're on this topic, do you find yourself having a regular practice, you know, that you stick to every day, or are you more go with the flow when you wake up?
There are certain things that I do every day. Abby and I are both very busy with our businesses. So morning time is a time that we have together. So she usually gets up before me. She has a deep morning practice where she does yoga and Kundalini breathing and all sorts of different things like that. And then I usually get up about an hour later. She has breakfast. I have a cup of coffee. We talk about our days. We talk about how we slept, dreams that we had, and then we take the dogs for a walk. That's pretty much always the morning structure. Beyond that, I'm very much I have to follow the flow of the day. I'm not great with structured routines. Um, yeah, I've tried everything. I've tried the 5 a.m. wake up, into cold shower, into exercise, into the millionaire mornings and all the rest of these things. And it never matched my personality type. I really need to start the day slowly and then work from there. And every day needs to be different. Otherwise, if every day had the same structure, I think I would just be bored.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've tried, but it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, it's something that I struggle with as well. Like I feel that it might benefit me to have a more structured morning, especially a daily practice in the morning. but I struggle to put it into action. And then the little voice comes on in the head, beating myself up, for not doing it or not sticking to it. And I don't know how much I would actually benefit from it, but then I resist it and I kind of get stuck in this loop.
Yeah. I'm trying 75 hard right now
Right, I saw that.
to see how I would work within a structure. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate with it is that the structure it's self-defined. So it's like the workout can be whatever your workout needs to be, and the nutrition plan can be whatever you want it to be, so on and so forth. But then there's like these 5 specific things that you're supposed to do every day. And I mean, I'm 8 days in and I'm already feeling such resistance to the structure. It's like, I'm gonna go outside and work out 45 minutes a day regardless, and do things like that, even if it's just a dog walk or I'm gonna go for a jog. But the fact that I have to do it, like, there's definitely a part of me that I'm like,
And it's 75 days, right?
75 days. Yeah. If I stick to it and I don't break, I will end 3 days before my 40th birthday. So that's why I did it. It was like a challenge to lead up to that.
That's great. I saw you invite others to join in, and once I saw the 2 workouts a day, I was like, fuck this. Like, I'm out.
But like for me, my first workout of the day is always just, I take the dogs for a walk. So we go for a 45-minute walk in the park. It's not like I'm not sweating or swearing or lifting weights or anything else like that. I'm like, I'm going to do that anyways. Like, even on my worst day, the dogs have to go out twice a day. So I can always just count those 2 things as the workouts if I need to for my own well-being. But I also did things like Andrew Funderburg invited me to join a virtual run. And so I signed up for a run at the end of the month. And now I'm like, okay, I have to get back into running shape. And I work well with a deadline. So hopefully this will be good and I'll be able to do this run at the end of the month. Yeah. But yeah.
What else is on that list that you have to do every day?
So it's 2 45-minute workouts a day. 1 must be outside. So with winter coming, that'll be interesting. You have to read 10 pages of a book that has some sort of self-improvement bent. Yep. So nonfiction of some kind. You have to drink a gallon of water a day. Unflavored water is what they say. You have to stick to your nutrition plan, whatever that is. They recommend, like, if you don't have a nutrition plan, just stick to whole foods. Mm-hmm. There's something else that I'm supposed to do that now I'm blanking on, because there was 5 different things. No, it's in my reminders, but yeah.
Hopefully you're actually doing it.
I'm doing it because I set up iPhone reminders to do these things every day. But I mean, like, it's basically water, nutrition, the 2 workouts, and reading. Like, those are the main things, main aspects of it. And no alcohol. That was the other one. So no alcohol for 75 days, which is not a problem for me. But yeah, having the group, I think, has been the biggest help for me. Not necessarily because it's particularly motivating, but just having the spiritual support. Somebody had a bad day the other day because they were doing a photo session with a client, and the client was really, really nervous. And so she brought a bottle of wine, and she's like, I had a little bit of the wine because it made my client feel better, but I guess I have to start all over again. But this particular group is like, no, like, just go do an extra 2,000 steps and call it. Like, you don't have to start over again. It's fine, because we're not being hyper rigid about it, but we're supportive. I think that's going to help me get through it the most.
That's so important for anything that we do. Any kind of rigidness like that, it's only going to be counterproductive. And that applies for, goals that we set ourselves, the way we raise our kids. Like, we need that ebb and flow as humans. Like, we're not programmed to be robots. We're human. That's the expression. So I'm happy to hear that you guys do have that flexibility to not be too hard on yourselves, and then, because that only brings you down afterwards, and then you're worse off.
Yeah, I mean, I find for a society that already has failure problems, if you had to, restart all the time, it's eventually going to lead to just stopping instead of failing forward. Like that simple thing of someone just said, like, do an extra 2,000 steps, and she's like, oh yeah, it's a great idea, great, I'm going to go take my dog for a walk. And then she didn't feel like she had failed. She just had to adjust her behavior or her habits in order to move forward, as opposed to it just being done. Like I did this experiment because I like to do weird things like this a couple of years ago, where you wore like a bracelet on one wrist, and every time you said something negative about yourself, you had to switch it to the other wrist. And it was this concept of trying to go 30 days without negative self-talk. And I felt like I failed every time I had to move it to the other wrist. And I eventually gave up on the experiment because I'm just like, it was just like constant failure. Sometimes 5 or 6 times a day, I'm having to do this. And there was no one just like coming around and being like, hey, it's okay to every now and again be a little hard on yourself. Like it felt like it had this like really rigid structure, which I just don't work well in.
Do you feel like you've gone better since you did that exercise, as much as you might feel that you failed, so to speak?
It definitely opened my eyes to the way that people talk about themselves, seeing it in me. And it's become a great tool for me when I'm coaching with my clients, because oftentimes people will be self-deprecating and gloss right over it. Like they don't even realize how poorly they treat themselves. And so it increased my perception of that. So now I can catch my clients in that language and challenge them on that language. Sometimes much to their dismay, but it definitely made me more aware.
Yeah, for me, I've learned this over the last couple of years, is once I bring awareness into something that I want to make change, I know that it will change, because it's always been the first step to bring that change in myself. So the moment I realize I'm doing something and I'm aware of it, I know that it's only a matter of time before it starts changing for good.
Yeah. I mean, because then you notice it every single time. Is it the Baader-Meinhof effect, where it's like once you're aware of something, you see it everywhere? It's like you buy a red car, and then all of a sudden all you see on the road is red cars, kind of thing. Yeah. I think the same thing could be said about ourselves.
Yeah. To go back to mushrooms, the general impression, I think, from everyone in that space is that it's becoming more and more mainstream, and it's only a matter of time before psilocybin and MDMA assisted therapies are much more accepted in society and much more available. Do you feel that that's indeed the case?
100%. Yeah, actually, funny anecdote. We had a camper van and we sold it recently, and the couple who bought our van were both retired psychotherapists who had just finished MAPS training for psilocin assisted therapy, and were moving out to Vancouver Island to do that specifically because it was already a little bit more accepted there. But the first clinic that opened in Canada opened here in Calgary for it. MAPS is doing great work all over the world. I think absolutely, from my own personal experience, I can do a large dose of mushrooms once a year and it sorts me out. I can't think of any other medicine aside from, ayahuasca or other psychedelics that are in this setting work in that way. So I think that the writing is on the wall. I think the largest struggle is going to be pharmaceutical companies being upset that you could give somebody 3 doses of something and they're better, as opposed to having to have this pill daily for the rest of their lives. But yeah, I think it's a matter of time, like years, not decades, before this is just commonplace.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of living this 60s and 70s all over again, but this time we have the internet, which, as much as we knock on it at times for some of the toxicity that exists with it, it's such a powerful tool for keeping everyone so connected. And I feel like this time around that it will be much harder for governments to step in and take away these beautiful tools that are actually helpful. Whereas, in the 60s, 70s, like communicating, quickly amongst such a large group of people was pretty much impossible. Now we have this amazing technology that enables all of that.
Yeah, I mean, the 60s, you have, one professor at one school who's doing something. It's very easy to shut him down when you can control the narrative. But now the narrative is democratic, it's everywhere. So even if they tried to shut it down from a clinical perspective, the knowledge is out there. Like I went and downloaded, there was a guide on how to, like, essentially the principles and practices of being a psychedelic assisted therapist. You could just download the PDF and read through it. I don't have the credentials, but I mean, I could technically use what they've created to guide my own clients through something like that if it wasn't available elsewhere. So I think we've passed that tipping point now where there's too much knowledge and it's out there that it's just a matter of time.
Mm-hmm. Having said all that, I do hope that it, people use it for good, and there's no abuse, and that it's treated with reverence and respect, and otherwise it will backfire, and it will have to go back underground, especially now that it's so widely available. And here in Costa Rica, look, I could walk out this afternoon and go to a retreat somewhere and consume some plants,
Yeah.
But I think it's important to look into, who's facilitating, and, make sure that you vet whoever you end up working with. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a piece of paper and a degree. I don't necessarily believe in, that structure either, but using our intuition and, discernment for who and how and where we work with the plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot learned, even with ayahuasca. When ayahuasca tourism became a thing, there was a lot of people who took advantage. But I think for the most part, that culture and that community self-regulated. I think with mushrooms, it's going to be similar, but with fewer mistakes. There's still going to be kids who are going to, take a handful of mushrooms and go to a party, and that's fine. That's how I got introduced to them for the first time. But I think that one of the things that I loved about a lot of the research that was being done at Johns Hopkins and Lord's College of London and whatnot was the fact that they said set and setting is important. Having a guide is important. All of this, it's not just like you take somebody with, let's just say, PTSD and you give them 3 grams of mushrooms and say, you're cured. It still requires process. When I did ayahuasca, it required the shaman. He had an effect on the experience. Had I just drank a cup of ayahuasca and laid down in a tent, it would have been very, very different than the structured environment with the ayahuasquero and everything else. So I think that with psilocin and with MDMA, the fact that they've built the structures, like as they've been doing the research, it's been built with these structures in mind. If people go and do it on their own, that's what they're going to be reading the entire time. I've had people reach out to me saying, I want to try this. I've read about this. I can't find a therapist that would do it. Do you know of any private retreats? Do you know a place where someone can walk me through it? And I think it's being set up for success in that way, because people are looking for guidance. It's not just like, hey, I can go to this, the parking lot behind the Denny's and buy a bag of mushrooms and figure myself out. Like they want a guide, which I think is helpful. And the piece of paper is being relaxed as well, because Abby reached out to one of the training centers here, and they said that they're actually looking for more shamanic practitioners and things like that to help people who understand the spiritual side of it, because the master's or PhD psychologists can really help with the mental aspect, but they don't always do well with the spiritual side.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
One other important aspect for people to know is that they're not habit forming, medicines. Yeah. Nobody, trips on 5 grams of mushrooms and wants to do it again the next day, or, sits with ayahuasca and then it's like, yeah, I'm going to do this every day. It's an intense experience, and it's beautiful in its own right. But I have yet to hear of anyone who's addicted to those substances.
No, usually for me, once a year is plenty. And then it's like, okay, I'm great. I'm done. I don't need to do this again. Not that it's an unenjoyable experience, but I think the experience itself lends to, like I was saying earlier, it's a full reset for me. And I don't want to reset every weekend. That would be exhausting.
Yeah. And you also need time to integrate whatever the experience is. And
yeah,
that takes a whole life of its own. I sat with ayahuasca almost a year ago, November 2020. Some things are still not fully integrated. I'm still trying to piece it together and see how it fits into my life,
Yeah. And there's support and businesses that are growing up around that. Abby knows a couple out in British Columbia who have set up an online integration business because people come home from an ayahuasca ceremony and then don't know how to integrate it or feel completely culture shocked coming back into regular life. And so they've created these like online support groups essentially for people who are like, this is the experience I had. How do I even deal with this? Yeah.
That's kind of what I experienced. And now I'm here in Costa Rica as a result.
Yeah.
It worked out okay. I'm not speaking of Abby, your wife and partner, how do you guys make space for spirituality in your relationship, and how does it play in your day-to-day?
This has been our biggest journey as a couple. I talked to her about this last night before coming on this podcast. I'm like, how candid are you comfortable with me being? And she's like, go for it. So I personally really struggled with her spiritual journey for quite a long time. Because in my mind, okay, so for some context, 2 weeks before we got married, Abby went and did ayahuasca for the first time. She was already struggling with a lot. She had been previously married. She was trying to unpack this. She was discovering herself at that point in time in veganism and everything, and was just dealing with a lot. She heard an interview with a Nat Geo person on CBC radio and booked her flights. And then 2 weeks before we got married, went and did this. She came back, in my mind at that time, a completely different person. So I went from, marrying the love of my life to now I'm marrying a stranger. I don't know who this person is. And that really knocked me back for a couple of years to a point where anytime Abby wanted to talk about something spiritual, I would get angry and remove myself from the situation. I didn't have a lot of spirituality growing up. My family went to church. I went to Christian summer camp, things like that, but it was all very soft-handed. It was not a huge part of our life. I didn't actually realize that my summer camp was a Christian summer camp until later in life when someone explained it to me. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess we did go to chapel, but that was it. Like it was archery and canoeing and things like that. But once a day we went and sang songs, and I just thought that was camp. It wasn't until I was, in my late teens, early 20s rebellious phase where I really, I became that asshole atheist that would challenge other people on their faith and stuff. And so when Abby became spiritual, to me, religion and spirituality were still very, very intertwined. And so I had my own spiritual wounding around that. And so we struggled for a lot of years, almost to the point of divorce. We came very, very close to separating in 2017. And then it was at that point in time, I realized that this wasn't her problem. This was my problem. I still to this day don't know where that realization came from, but it was just one of those, stroke of insight moments where it's just like, oh shit, this is all me. I'm the asshole here. So I had to do that self-work. And part of that meant I had to understand what ayahuasca was, because it was such a turning point in her life that I'm like, I'm never going to understand who she is until I understand what this experience is, because everything that I had read online or read in books or watched in documentaries was different. Everybody's experience was different. It was hard to explain. It was untenable. It was esoteric and spiritual. And so I'm like, okay, until I just go and do this thing for myself, I'm not going to get it. So I went to Colombia and I did an ayahuasca ceremony and Wachuma and sweat lodges and all the rest of this. And I remember texting her after my first ayahuasca ceremony with just, I get it. And she said that was the best text message of her entire life. Because you can't get it until you get it. And so that changed a lot. And then that finally allowed spirituality to be part of our daily life. If you were to rank spirituality on a scale, Abby is definitely a 10. I think I'm still around maybe a 5 or 6. So there are things that she talks about that are still, to me, I still don't understand them, but I'm able to listen to them now, and I'm able to get excited for her and with her when she has these experiences and these breakthroughs and whatnot. Whereas before, it was always resistance that came up. And I was reading, do you know the Gottman Institute?
No.
So they were relationship therapists and did multi-year, sometimes multi-decade studies around successful relationships. And they had actually got to a point where they could statistically prove if a couple was going to stay together. And they called it, I think it was like the bird response. And it was essentially if one partner sees a really beautiful bird and says, hey, look, a beautiful bird. If 33% of the time or more, the other partner turned and looked at the bird and said, oh, that is a really beautiful bird, they would likely work out. But if the other person turned away or just dismissed it or whatever, more often than not, they would probably fail. I think within like a 96% accuracy rate, within the time of this study, they could figure it out. And I realized, reading a Gottman book, that I was turning away from Abby every single time she said, oh, look at this beautiful bird, around spirituality. And now I can turn towards. Now I worked on myself and healed that wound in me. So now I can turn towards, and I can see how much better our relationship is because of it.
I feel like I teeter probably right around that 35% mark. I'm like just barely, it's, I'm aware of it, that, I need to be more present and just like in the moment, make it more of a priority when, Davina says something that something that I'm exploring and discovering so that I can better our relationship as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you said earlier, it's just being aware of it helps. And it was when I became aware of that, it was me turning away. Abby's spirituality wasn't a problem. She could be whoever she wants to be. But before I had that awareness, her spirituality was the problem. Like I had nothing to do with that. Is the fact that she was a spiritual person. Well, that was the problem in our marriage. And I couldn't see it any other way. And then once I became aware that I had to fix this thing in me, and then I also had to be a good partner and be excited for her. Like I'll talk about things that she's not interested in at all, but she turns towards more often than not. And it feels really nice. It feels validating, and it feels like you're a partnership. And so it became that awareness in me that even if I don't understand it, I can be excited for her.
Mm-hmm. And I assume, knowing her and having gone through a similar path with Davina, I'm sure she wasn't pressuring you into finding your own spirituality. She was, probably accepting of, your own journey and however long it was going to take, maybe at the detriment of your marriage at that point. But
she was accepting to a certain point when she could see that I couldn't see the thing in myself that was the problem. And that was sort of what led to the almost separation, because she never said you have to be a spiritual person. That was one thing that I always appreciated. She just said, I need to be with a partner that accepts me for who I am, which that's any relationship. If you can't do that, it's not going to work out. And so, yeah, she was never like, oh, you have to go do ayahuasca, or you have to read this book, or you have to go to this smudging ceremony with me. That was never what she wanted. She wanted me to be me, but she also wanted to feel accepted in our relationship.
Yeah. I'll ask you this question that you asked me last year or the year before, which I didn't really have an answer for. And I still am discovering you probably know what that question is, but how would you define spirituality?
Oh man. Yeah.
I hated you for asking me that question. So,
so you get to turn the tables. I think spirituality is just someone trying to understand the universe in which they live in. And for everybody, it's different. we as humans are wired for belonging. We never want to feel like we're outside of our tribe. You know, we're running 50,000-year-old software where if we got kicked out of the tribe, a saber-toothed tiger was going to eat us, or we're going to freeze, or we're going to starve. We required collective acceptance in order to survive. And now that's not the case. You can live on your own and take care of yourself, but we still want collective acceptance. And I think spirituality is sort of that on a broader level, where we also want to feel accepted by the universe in which we live. And everybody's answer and viewpoint is different, whether there is a God or whether there is just energy that intertwines us, whether or not when you drink ayahuasca that you can see, you know, Mother Ayahuasca, or you can't. You know, some people still who drink. There's a person who went to my retreat who I'm still in contact with, and he still refers to his journeys as tripping balls. You know, to him, it's a spiritual journey, but also he's like, I also understand that there's a chemical that's affecting my brain, and I'm having a hallucinogenic experience. Like, it doesn't take away from the spirituality for him. But other people may be offended by that term because to them it is this deeply personal journey connection with a plant and with their ancestors or whomever. So I think spirituality is just trying to figure out how we belong in the universe.
Well said. And I hope that humans become more and more accepting of each other's individual spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's something that we all share, and we might be looking at it through different lenses, but I do believe that there's some kind of point of, you know, a common denominator, which is, you know, that we're all part of this big universe, and we're all the same, just living our own experiences. One of our best friends, you probably, Robbie, you know, follow well, you know, he's Christian, you know, from Mississippi, and we've had so many deep conversations about faith and spirituality, and it's pretty incredible how much we see eye to eye. We just use different terms to describe essentially the same thing. I do hope to have him on this podcast one day to, you know, talk about it, because it's such a unique perspective and conversation whenever we get talking about this. I think a lot more people need to have more of these open-minded conversations with people of different religions and faiths, and extending that to, you know, different opinions as well on whatever the topics are, just so we can all better understand each other.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like, part of there's a group of 3 couples who once every couple of years we go and rent a cabin in the woods, and we do mushrooms together, and then we sit around and have a big meal and have long conversations. And one of the couples is very Christian, and originally it was 2 of the couples were very Christian, and then there was Abby and I. One couple has moved away from the church, but the other, their faith has actually strengthened because of these journeys. And there's no judgment in that space because of it, because we can all just talk about, we take the R word, religion, out of it, and we just talk about experience and connection. And, you know, for them, energy might mean God and faith, whereas for us, energy might mean this feeling that we feel connected to other people, and the language matters less than the message. And it took me a long time to get, like I mentioned earlier, with my spiritual wounding around religion. I would judge other people just because they were in a church, not understanding that maybe they're just there for community, or they're there for belonging, or they're there because that's how they grew up. And that's, all of those reasons are valid reasons, as long as it's not harmful.
Yeah, exactly. We're so quick to judge others for things that are different from the way that we do or think. And all it takes is a little bit more open and honest conversation to see that we're all so much more alike than not.
Yeah, grace and compassion goes a long way to make your life a lot easier. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. As always, I love chatting with you. Any final tips, any final thoughts you want to share?
I'm gonna drag out this old one that I tell every time. So whenever somebody asks me for a singular piece of advice, I always say there's this Jim Rohn quote that has proven true in my life time and time again, that you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I have updated that slightly for the modern media age and say that that also includes the media you consume and the things that you watch and read, and what you surround yourself with becomes true in your life.
It's a beautiful reminder. Thank you.
Yeah.
Where can people find you or follow you?
I am Dave Moss Coach pretty much everywhere on the internet. That's where I am on Instagram, on Twitter. You can go to davemoss.coach as my website. But that's probably the easiest place to find me if you want to find me. But I'm always open for great conversations if anyone has any questions.
I didn't know .coach was an option.
Yeah, as soon as I saw that as a domain, I'm like, I'm getting it. That's awesome.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for accepting my invitation and hopping on my little experiment.
Oh yeah, it was an absolute joy. I send my love to Davina and the kids, and hopefully we can come down and see you guys sometime soon.
We'll do, and please do, and hopefully we'll see you in your neck of the woods as well.
Absolutely, always welcome.
Much love, Dave.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
And pause.